This is my intro. There are many others like it, but this one is mine. Hi, greetings and salutations. My name is Dan, and you're watching Boilerplate Socialism. Thank you for being with me here today. I didn't update this Thursday or Friday because I had a bunch of personal stuff going on in my life, and I'm starting school soon, so in the future we'll see what my schedule looks like. For now, I'll try to keep to my current schedule. Keyword try. So anyways, thank you for tuning in. Today I want to talk a little bit about imperialism. Imperialism is something that, well, really most people know, but we've often been, at least in the West, taught that it doesn't exist anymore. Dictionary definition: imperialism is when one country enforces its will upon another with military or diplomatic means. In a Marxist sense, imperialism is actually the highest form of capitalism. There were many philosophers who believed that imperialism was a hangover, a leftover, or a atavistic trait from more primitive organizations like feudalism or the slave economies. Nothing could be further from the truth. As it stands, capitalism goes through roughly three phases of development that we've seen so far. The first is mercantilism. This is a system that's built upon trade, privateering, and, well, private property. That's the start of it. Think the early European colonialism, before imperialism really kicked off. And then you have the so-called liberal capitalism. This is when a country has become fully industrialized and has become engaged fully in commodity production. That means that all feudal remnants or tribal remnants or family bonds have been dissolved, and everything is in service of production. After this comes imperialism, in which a country has to go out with their newly industrialized power and make new markets in other countries in the periphery. We'll call them the periphery. There's the core and the periphery of imperialism. Now, the reason for this is that capitalism is a system that always requires constant, eternal growth. To use a modern example, Netflix is losing its stock price not because they're losing money, but because they're not growing. So if capitalism isn't growing, if a business isn't growing, it's in crisis, especially in the eye of its shareholders. And going back to that second phase of capitalism, the liberalization, there was already crisis, because if you can look to Europe in the 1820s to the 1860s, there were a series of revolutions across the continent as places became fully industrialized and feudalism was fully overthrown. And in these cases, commodity production would be fully taken over. The commons, where people could farm in public land and grow their own food, was outlawed. People were forbidden from collecting wild firewood. So they really had no choice but to work in the newly found factories and cotton mills. Now the problem with this was that these mills were looking to sell goods all the time at higher costs. So eventually something had to give, and this led to crashes. In the case of Europe, it led to basically an economic depression once a decade for 40 years and more. And this was really only assuaged when European colonialism really kicked off. And this is the start of imperialism as we know it today, about the 1860s and about the 1890s for Japan. In this case, they went to other countries and through the process of colonialism partially or fully took control of those countries for economic gain. And during this time, they would either extract raw materials at dirt cheap prices from these countries, usually paid for in blood, or they would sell European goods to these countries at inflated prices, or some combination of the two in varying degrees. This is how colonialism has worked. In the more modern day example, you have places like the United States enforcing its empire with 800-odd military bases, and it has exported whole industries, not just factories, entire industries to the imperial periphery, because it's cheaper to ship goods overseas than it is to pay people a living or even a minimum wage. It was originally Lenin who voiced the idea of imperialism as the highest form of capitalism, because the system does need eternal, constant growth. And that's the difference between capitalism and, say, feudalism and the slave economy. You can have slave economies that are very insular and very inward-looking. For example, we have pre-communist Tibet, which was a slave economy. About 70% of their population were slaves. Or ancient Sparta, which again was not an expansionist power except in a continental sense. They're very inward-looking. And likewise, you have feudal powers like the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. They're very inward-looking, they're very insular. There have been slave economies and feudal economies that practice imperialism, but that was just to do primitive accumulation. I'm going to come over here, I'm going to steal this land, I'm going to steal this treasure. It wasn't in the sense of I'm going to come to this land, I'm going to knock over the ruling elite, and I'm going to build factories or build mines or build railroads that I can then invest in and grow my money every single quarter until the end of time. The thing with capitalism is that it always leads to imperialism. Places like the United States and Canada were founded on imperialism. The genocide of the native peoples on the continent, this is very, very foundational to the nations. I mean, as much as George Washington talked about not getting involved in European powers, he was very much involved in colonialism on the continent and later on in South America. And again, so capitalism always leads to imperialism. Japan was a feudal country that was inward looking for centuries, and when it turned to capitalism, it began to experience economic booms and busts. And to alleviate these busts and to acquire the cheap raw materials needed to keep the whole machine going, they turned to colonialism in Asia, quickly abandoning any kind of co-Asian prosperity that liberals had come up with at the time during the liberal phase of Japan's development. So this is important to bring up because as Marxists and as human beings with empathy, we must always oppose imperialism whether it appears. The Iraq War, the Afghan War, the current United States involvement in Ukraine are all examples of imperialism, and we must oppose them. Because this is how the imperial core keeps its power and maintains its power. Those 800 U.S. military bases don't pay for themselves, they're expensive, and they have to be paid for in the blood and treasure of people in the periphery. So I hope this has been enlightening. I went a little bit longer than I thought I would because it's frankly a very complex subject. I'm really just doing an intro of it. I'm almost doing a disservice, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm always here. I welcome friendly discussion. Please remember to like and subscribe. Next week is school for me, so wish me luck. And I want to thank every single person who has liked, subscribed, or left a comment. Thank you very much. You know who you are, and have a fantastic day. This is my outro. There are many others like it, but this one is mine.